So the last paper is cognitive exploration agents with vision, signage understanding. And it's authored by Colin Johnson and Brandon Howard.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. I'm Dr. Brandon Haworth. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Victoria. I'm the director of the Graphics AI Design and Games Lab here, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health. And I'm joining you from beautiful Vancouver Island off the west coast of Canada. So it's very early in the morning for me. I'm going to talk about a topic that kind of combines all those interests in those facilities that I work in. I'm going to start by motivating kind of our classic approach, and I'm sort of necessarily going to generalize. We've heard a lot about crowds in the last couple of presentations, but basically we'll represent people as agents, and typically this will be a particle, so we'll have some particle representation of those agents. We'll represent the environment in some way. You can sort of choose your flavor of representation there, whether it's line obstacles or axis line bounding boxes or meshes, whatever you would like. And then we have some spatial representation of a goal. So this is probably some vector 2 or vector 3 in our environment. And we'll use our classic good old friend A star to solve a long-term path. So we have some sort of long-term planner that's going to tell us how to get from where we are to that goal in the environment. And that environment typically is going to be dynamic. It's going to be full of other characters and other things happening. So typically we'll have some set of rules. We've heard about some other methods that produce these rules. They can be produced in many different ways, but typically they allow us to avoid others, avoid other obstacles, and to reach our goals at the same time. So in this case, maybe the blue particle is going to try to avoid the yellow particle and the orange particle and the wall while moving towards its goal. And that's an intermediate goal in that long-term path plan. And that's kind of nice. It's a fairly compact representation, and we can choose how to make those rules up, whether they're data-driven, machine learning, sort of expert-driven, or some sort of psychological model, something like that. You can kind of pick how you want to approach that. There's lots and lots of fantastic papers on that. And it will give us trajectories, basically, over time. We'll move around the environment in a compelling way. In fact, if we put all this together and we animate characters on top of it, we can get these very compelling scenarios where even in this scenario where the AI for these characters is actually very, very, very simple. All they're doing is choosing a random exhibition in an art gallery and walking towards it. And then eventually, after some random amount of time, choosing another one. Nothing's really happening here. We can get these nice, compelling scenarios with emergent properties where it looks like things are happening. Maybe people are mulling around, talking about art, lane forming as they pass in big groups and so on. Now, there's an interesting issue here, though, and it's kind of why I derived this sort of contrived scenario. What happens when we know what we're looking for, and we would know when we found it, but we don't know where it is? And this happens all the time. I'm sure we've all been lost at some point in some building of some level of good or poor design, or a building we've just never been to, an environment we've never been to before. So in this scenario, what do we do? Would we take the left path or the right path? We don't have that global information we would do long-term planning on. And both, from a naive sort of standpoint, are equally good candidates for what we should do. So what happens if we choose one path and that thing we were looking for isn't there? Well, we've gone the wrong way, of course. What could we have done? Well, we could search. We tried the B path already. Let's call that the B hallway already. And we know it's not there, so we can try A now. We could also take cues from the environment, because often designers, when they're building environments, will try to structure them in a way that kind of leads us where you're likely to want to go. So areas that are more open typically are where they want big audiences to go and so on, especially if you see this in convention centers. Areas that are more closed might be service routes or maintenance routes. And so we can take cues from that environment design and go those directions. And of course, our friend, the sign telling us which way we should go. What do we do, though, in this classic approach if we encounter a sign, and how do we see that information? And what do we just do with it generally? how do we take all of this information, signage, environment design, and so on, and integrate it in a way that the information is useful and these behaviors make use of that information in some automatic way. So if I have some arbitrarily complex scenario, I'm able to follow that information in a way that's reasonable. So I start with our basic agent structure, and this is what you will see in most modern game engines as your standard agent structure, except for a couple of small components here. So we have a capsule-shaped rigid body because it's kind of like a particle shape, but it will slide over most arbitrary terrain. We have a rigged character for skeletal animation. We can drive that with mocap or all kinds of neat, interesting methods. And we have some camera attached to the head bone. This is something that isn't typical. And we have an event-driven behavior tree driving this. It's kind of the brain. And that is sort of typical, but we're using event-driven on purpose, which might not be typical for your average game design. We're going to do local steering and collision avoidance. So we're going to use one of those methods that, given a series of waypoints, will tell us where to go. For this paper, we use predictive avoidance model, Yanis Kermouzis et al. So fantastic approach, gives us anticipatory collision avoidance using force-based method. But the way the method is written, this is actually sort of plug and play. We know that different crowd models give us different behaviors. So if you didn't really want to use PAM for whatever reason, and you wanted to use some other method, this method isn't invalidated by that. You could simply swap them out and choose your favorite crowd simulator model for steering and collision avoidance. Now, we are talking about vision-driven, but vision is kind of hard and expensive to do real time, especially with lots and lots of agents. So to make this kind of from a cognitive standpoint, we want to talk about salient objects. So things that when we're walking around as humans stand out to us. A visually salient object is something that's interesting to us. It stands out. We want to look at it or pay attention to it. And we're going to model two versions of that, signage and distractions. And we're going to do that using some recent work in estimating saliency maps. So there's this work that I was on making parametric saliency maps where basically everything's parametric. The value of an item in a scene, its saliency is set by you as the artist or the designer. You can sort of choose what that is. And we blend all of these together in a parametric way, so you can weight all of the saliencies in a scene. And the interesting thing here was that machine learning-based saliency methods, which are really fantastic and based on awesome data sets, tend not to be real time. They're not fast enough to do this for every character in real time. In fact, some of them aren't even fast enough to do this for a single character in real time, and often take multiple seconds to produce a result. So we, because we have all these free parameters and we can very easily measure the error between a saliency method's output and our output, we can actually fit for particular saliency methods. So we can estimate saliency methods we like deep gaze or salicon or something like that. And we can process that information, and we can do basic blob tracking, which is what you see here, and thresholding so that we can track particular salient objects in the scene. Once we're tracking them, the weight of that object, the sort of under the blob weight of it, so we have all these values for its saliency, can be kind of added up. And we can think of that like a probability of, well, I'm going to look at that because it has a high value. And I can store all of this in something like a priority queue. So each one of these objects is going to have an ID. So we have a shader that pumps out IDs of objects and their current value. And we might sort this in the priority queue in real time. You can kind of choose the way you want to use this. And this is sort of a memory model of the things you're looking at and things that are interesting to you. So say, for example, this green sphere is interesting, the red sphere is a little less interesting, and the blue sphere is a little less interesting. And we will actually attenuate these with time. So if I'm looking at something that's very interesting, it's going to lose interest. And this is how we kind of interact with salient or interesting objects in real life, typically. And we can animate a character and their gaze based on that. We can follow that sort of simple vision processing. This is all coming out of the GPU in real time, and do some very simple image processing to follow that. And really the hardest part of that is maybe the blob tracking. But we want to get that information and quantify it in a way that's useful for navigation and steering. Thankfully, I'm not sure if Nuri is in the room right now, but we were working on this, scratching our head about how to do this in a way that's really compact and makes a lot of sense. And this paper came out, and we're like, eureka, perfect. This fixes our problem. So we can modify A star and add this sort of small modification in terms of lambda that tells us how well we know an area of the environment. And the worse it is, the worse that heuristic is. So we're not very likely to plan down areas we don't know that well. So from our perspective, this is what it looks like. We use it a little differently. You can store your world geometry in some sort of grid. You have an agent with a goal. That agent can see. It has its own camera, so we're processing from their point of view. The agent might see a sign with partial navigation information. Maybe this is directional or a map. And the navigation information is then going to be dispersed onto a navigation grid. And so we're very sure about information near that sign, and that kind of falls off as it gets further away. And then we can run that A star, and it's going to plan this sort of fuzzy intermediate goal. It's going to, because of that heuristic, kind of follow that gradient. And then when it gets to the end and it kind of falls off, this is where things differ a bit. It's just going to kind of end. And that's going to be where we no longer know where we're going. We had information to get there, and we're not really sure where to go next. To interact with that sign, though, we have to answer a couple of questions, like what distances and angles the sign is actually legible, and how long it should take to actually acquire that information. And thankfully, there's a few works that actually solve that for us. And essentially, based on sign information, like how big it is, how small the smallest legible item is, we can come up with a visual catchment area, an area where we know the sign is readable, and we can react to that. So basically, our behavior tree can say, like, go into that visual catchment area, look at the sign, and gather the information you need, and then disperse it into your navigation grids. So we can do this with all kinds of information. This is sort of an ad hoc scenario where we do directional and global information, and you can see that information being dispersed as the agent interacts with those signs. But what happens when we get to that point where we don't know where we're at, right? So it's going to start kind of the same. We're going to store the world geometry in some grid, and then we're going to do something called generating a visibility graph. We've never run into these before. It's basically every cell in the grid, we test pairwise visibility. And so the nice thing about this is we pre-bake this. We wouldn't do this in real time. It's really expensive. It takes forever to compute. And trust me, it takes a very long time to draw. I regret trying to draw this by hand. And the nice thing about that, though, is we can compute a bunch of metrics that have been shown in the literature to kind of model how humans explore environments and emulate their behavior. And just as a set of examples of the type of metrics, we can just do degree on that graph. We can do entropy on that graph or depth on that graph. And these have sort of real world meanings to us, visibility, organization, and accessibility, respectively. So planning on that, let's take a different scenario. So we bake that visibility graph metric information into its own grid. And then we have an agent again. This time, it doesn't know where it is. There's no sign. It's a little bit lost. It's not sure which way to go. And there is some concept of a goal, and it will know where it should be when it finds it. But it doesn't know where that point is in the environment. I'm sure we've all been lost at some point. And we can't see this information. We don't know where we're at. We can only see what we can see. So to make use of that information, we basically intersect an isovist with that grid and only make use of the information that's local to us, and then do a modified A star again and plan that fuzzy intermediate goal, which is most likely going to be a much shorter distance away because it's only within the isovist formed by the agent, their field of view, and the environment. This just keeps repeating. We plan fuzzy goals over and over again until we reach our final goal. And once we can see it, we don't have to really do this anymore. We can kind of jump out of that part of the behavior tree and just go towards the goal using our regular steering and so on. And of course, the agent could get lost anywhere along the way, but because it has this baked information, it can hopefully find itself. And this is kind of it in action, where the agent has no idea where it's going. It's completely lost. This is a simple scenario, though, and it's walking around. One nice thing about this is you can see some extra information here that we do in real time. We actually attenuate the local isovist area of the agent and the goals so they don't get stuck in like local minima and so on. Putting this all together, we have this nice sort of complex model that has lots and lots of parameters. Here I generate a sort of worst case scenario. If you imagine two groups of very clueless tourists who have no idea where they're going and very short memories, you would get a crowd simulation kind of like this. But for the future, just to motivate the future work, this is a simple example. The decision here is very straightforward. You have a single character walking out and trying to decide whether to go left or right. And what we're working on right now is, because we're using vision and it's all GPU based, we can start emulating actual issues with vision, like glaucoma. Here we do low severity and high severity and show that the high severity, they actually miss the signage that tells them where to go, and they go the wrong way because the exploration metric is based on the building design. So while they may have wanted to go to the office, they may end up going to a big waiting area. Similarly with myopia, we can do all kinds of cool depth of field things so that we can see exactly how an agent would see that from their perspective and what they would do. And if their myopia is severe enough, they might not actually notice the sign. It might not be salient enough after being rendered in that depth of field method. Thank you. Just a heads up, graphics interfaces in Victoria, BC. So if you like mountains and the ocean, come join us next year. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Nuria?
Hi, Brandon, can you hear me?
I can repeat the question.
Nice work. I was wondering again, why get this? Are you, as the agents navigate the environment, are they building a mental map of the environment so they have to remember where they've been before? And when they see one of the signals that has a full map on it, do you assume they fully understand that information? Because depending on the complexity of the signs in those maps, you know, everybody's able to remember exactly the terms.
Did you hear the question?
I think it was kind of long, and I caught like 40% of it.
Okay.
Memory? Is there a memory? And how much you assume when people see a map, they can remember that exact information?
Do they build a mental map of the environment as they go along?
Yeah. Yes. So in this, I guess you would call it the navigation layer of this. They can add information to that and build that mental model of the environment. If they've already been to an area, then their familiarity with that area is really high. So the modified A star works really well, I guess you would say. But it does kind of short-term plan in the sense that it's never going to be global unless they're familiar with everything. And we have played with making that fall off. So for example, with the entropy metric, if an environment gets increasingly more complex and they're planning something really far away, that information might fall off even though they have global information about where to go because they've seen a map, for example, and a sign. They may not be able to get all of the way there because it's so confusing. And so we made the model quite parametric so that you could kind of choose a cognitive level. It was an important part of what we were doing. So people could have more memory or less memory, or it could fall off lower, quicker or slower. It might be harder to gather from signs. So they might not be, there's a parameter actually for how well they gather information from a sign as well.
I have a question as well. I mean, you paid a lot of attention on animating and moving the camera, the eyes of the character correctly so that they can observe the signs and also. But then you run them on a grid using a star. I mean, do the trajectories and subsequently the animation of the head corresponds to reality?
It's a good question. I think this is just a general problem in crowd simulation. Of course, ideally we would use like nav meshes or something like that. We're still going to use A star to do long-term planning. We need something to do a planner. And we have other methods that do this in a much higher fidelity way. But in terms of like cognitively navigating an environment, this works pretty well. And our trajectories are mostly based on assumptions about any of the models you use in the steering part. So we use PAM for this. So we get PAM quality trajectories, but it could just be as easy as using social forces, TTC, or so on. The grid formulation is, I would say, like kind of a fundamental drawback because it doesn't so easily map onto, say, like NavMesh because we're storing things in cells, but it gives us the ability to do the visibility graph computation. There's a more continuous way of doing this with isovist from like space syntax literature and building design, but we didn't do that. I think it would be a nice next work, a more continuous version of it.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. I think we're done with this session.